Summer was the time of year I loved going to the outdoor gym in the local park the most. The heat of the day was too intense, so I usually went at night, when the air was cooler and the park was nearly empty. That place was my refuge. Working out helped me relieve stress, especially after a long day. I never imagined that something so routine and comforting could turn into a nightmare. That night, everything seemed normal. The streetlights dimly illuminated the area, and I was focused on my exercises. I heard footsteps in the distance, but I didn't pay much attention. It was common to see a few people strolling through the park at night. It was only when I finished my set and stood up to grab some water that I noticed the man. He was standing a few meters away, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on me. I had never seen him before. "Hey, how's it going?" he said suddenly, his voice low and casual, but with a strange familiarity that unsettled me. I nodded back, trying to be polite, but without engaging much. I was there to work out, not to make friends, but the man kept coming closer, which was already uncomfortable enough. What scared me the most was when he called me by name. "So, Thomas, you come here often, huh?" I froze for a second. I didn't remember mentioning my name to him, and I definitely didn't know him. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to hide my surprise and asked, my heart racing, "Do we know each other?" He smiled in a strange way, without directly answering, and began asking personal questions. Where I lived, if I lived alone, things no one would ask a stranger in the park, especially at night. I felt that something was terribly wrong. I said I needed to get back to my workout, and, trying to stay calm, I moved to the other side of the makeshift gym, attempting to distance myself from him without running. The man stood there, watching me for a few more minutes before finally walking away and disappearing into the darkness of the park. When he was gone, a mix of relief and deep discomfort washed over me. I couldn't finish my workout that night. I grabbed my things and headed home as fast as I could, my mind racing, replaying the way he knew my name. The next morning, discomfort gave way to panic. When I stepped out of the house to grab the newspaper, I found a brown envelope in my mailbox with no return address. I thought it was odd, but what was inside was even more disturbing. Pictures of me, several, taken from a distance, all while I was at the park at night, working out. Some were from the previous night, taken from angles that suggested the man had been watching me for longer than I realized. But what chilled me to the bone was the last picture in the envelope. A photo of me sleeping in bed inside my own room. I had no idea how he had managed to take that picture, and terror gripped me as I considered that he might have broken into my house or spied through a window. The thought that someone had been watching me so closely, without my realizing, left me feeling completely vulnerable. I immediately showed the photos to my family, and everyone was on high alert. We went to the police, who opened an investigation into the possible stalker. The detectives took the photos as evidence and promised to monitor the park area, but the uncertainty of what could happen next gnawed at me. We knew the man had been close, watching me in ways I never imagined. The weeks that followed were tense. I didn't go back to the park, nor did I leave the house at night. Every noise on the street made me run to the window. Every shadow seemed to hide that man's face. My family decided it was time to find a new place to live. Fear had seeped into our home in such a way that it was impossible to continue living there, knowing that the stalker could be watching us at any moment. The police investigation didn't progress much. The man remained just a shadow in the dark, an invisible threat. No matter how hard they tried, they didn't find any concrete clues beyond the anonymous photos and the vague descriptions I could provide. Without a name or any detail beyond his disturbing behavior, he seemed to have disappeared as quietly as he had appeared, in a haunting and silent way. Moving was the only solution we found to regain some peace. Leaving the neighborhood where I grew up, the house where I had spent my whole life, was painful, but the sense of security, or at least the attempt to rebuild it, was more important. Even so, the trauma of that experience still lingers with me. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he chose to stalk me. Perhaps I'll never find out. But one thing is certain. From that moment on, my life changed. Now, every night when I feel alone, every unknown sound reminds me that danger can be lurking much closer than we ever imagine. I was 8 years old when I went to my first summer festival. My older sister was excited, and my grandparents seemed happy to take us for an afternoon filled with music and fun. It was a big event with food stalls everywhere, loud music, and people all around. The heat was intense, but the air was buzzing with energy, the kind of atmosphere that made you feel part of something larger. I remember sitting with my sister while my grandmother went to get drinks. We were laughing, watching the people around us, when suddenly the music was interrupted by something different. A loud, sharp noise, a bang that echoed through the festival area. At first, I didn't understand what it was. My initial thought was that it could be part of the music, maybe some special effect from the stage. But then, I saw the look on my sister's face and the faces of the people around us. Someone screamed, and chaos began. From where we were sitting, we could see people running in all directions, some shouting, others dropping to the ground. It didn't take long for me to realize what was happening: gunfire. A fight that had broken out near one of the food stalls had escalated into something far worse. My sister pulled me behind the bench where we were sitting, trying to keep us hidden. My heart was racing, not fully understanding what was going on, but the fear on her face terrified me. It felt like time had slowed down. I could hear screams mixed with the sound of people running and the music still playing in the background, as if the festival was trying to ignore the horror unfolding. We crouched for what felt like an eternity, as the crowd thinned out and the sound of gunfire eventually stopped. Slowly, things seemed to return to normal, but the tension in the air didn't go away entirely. I looked around, trying to spot my grandparents. My grandmother had returned and found us crouching, her face pale as she gripped our hands tightly. "It's okay now, let's go back to our seats," she said, trying to stay calm. We went back to where we had been sitting, but nothing felt the same. The air was heavy, and even though people were trying to act like everything was under control, you could see the fear in the eyes of those who had stayed. Everyone was waiting for the nightmare to start again. And then it did. Another gunshot echoed across the area, and this time it was even clearer. There was no doubt the danger wasn't over. My body froze for a second before my grandmother pulled me close, hugging me tightly as my sister pushed us away from the stage. We ran, our legs shaking, and my heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. I looked around, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from, but everything was a blur of people screaming and moving away. The last thing I remember from that festival was running towards the exit with my family. The music had stopped, and the sirens were starting to wail. I saw some people lying on the ground, and my grandmother did everything she could to keep me looking straight ahead, steering me away from that horrible scene. We finally reached the parking lot, where we huddled into the car without saying a word. My grandmother and sister were visibly shaken, trying to stay calm, but their eyes showed the fear that we all felt. We didn't talk much on the way home. The sound of gunshots still echoed in my head, and the sense of insecurity hung in the air, as if we were still there, trapped in that moment. When we finally got home, my mother greeted us with eyes full of concern. She had already heard about the shooting on the news, and her tight hug made me realize we were finally safe. Sitting at the kitchen table that night, my mother was firm. We wouldn't be going to any more festivals for a long time. At that moment, I still didn't fully grasp the gravity of what had happened. To me, it felt like the festival had turned into a nightmare we had finally escaped from. But the fear and tension stayed with me long after that day. That summer festival, which was supposed to be fun and joyful, became a terrifying experience I would never forget. I never thought something like that could happen to us in such a public place, surrounded by families and children. But there I was, an 8-year-old child, confronting a frightening reality. That night forever changed my perception of safety. It was a summer night, and Sarah, Emily, and I decided to go to the local bowling alley to enjoy the break. The day's heat had eased, and the air was cool, perfect for a night of fun. We laughed, played, and teased each other the entire time we were there. We were in high spirits when we left around 11 p.m., chatting about who had the highest score and which strikes were the most memorable. The parking lot was quiet, almost empty. It was a place that had always felt safe, so we didn't think twice as we walked toward Sarah's car. However, we quickly noticed two men near a pickup truck, leaning against it, watching us more intently than normal. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just imagining things, but I could tell Sarah and Emily had noticed too. "Hey girls!" One of them shouted suddenly as we got closer to the car. "Need some company to keep the night going?" We pretended not to hear, walking faster towards Sarah's car. She quickly pulled out her keys and got in the car, and Emily and I followed suit. But when Sarah tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn on. She turned the key again, and nothing. The silence inside the car grew heavy, and I could feel the nervousness rising in all of us. We were stuck there, and the men began to approach. "Looks like you're having some trouble," one of them said with a grin that did nothing to reassure us. "Need a hand?" "No, we're fine, thanks," Sarah replied quickly, trying not to show panic. But the two men kept standing there, too close, making the situation more and more uncomfortable. My heart started to race. The thought that we were stranded with a broken-down car, while these men kept coming closer, terrified me. Sarah, trying to stay calm, discreetly grabbed her phone and called her dad, asking him to come pick us up as quickly as possible. But we knew it would take him a few minutes to get there, and every second felt like an eternity. "Let's go back to the bowling alley," Emily whispered, her voice tense. We tried to mask our fear as we got out of the car and quickly made our way back to the entrance of the bowling alley. The men followed us for a few steps, but stopped short of going inside. Once we were back inside, we sat near the entrance, feeling a bit safer but still with our hearts pounding. We kept an eye on the two men outside, now standing by the truck, occasionally throwing glances in our direction. Thankfully, Sarah's dad arrived quickly. As soon as we saw his car pull up, we bolted outside, relieved. The men, realizing they had no further chance to hassle us, got into their truck and drove off without another word. We got into Sarah's dad's car, and only then did the weight of the tension we had been holding and hit us. We were safe, but the fear from that night wouldn't be easily forgotten. When we got home, Sarah told her mom everything, and the next day my mom made it clear we wouldn't be going to places like that alone for a while. There were no injuries or major damage, but the experience left its mark. What was supposed to be a fun night had turned into a nightmare, one that luckily ended without more serious consequences. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. Working on a cruise had always been one of my biggest dreams. At 23, when I got the chance to train for a position, I was thrilled. It was the opportunity to travel the world and have a unique experience. The ship was immense, filled with new faces and endless possibilities, and I was ready to embrace this new phase of my life. During the first few days of training, I met several people, all just as excited as I was. One of them was an older man around 60, who was also part of the program. At first, he seemed friendly, just interested in chatting like everyone else. But as time went on, his interactions started to make me uncomfortable. Whenever I was in a common area of the ship, like the cafeteria or the training halls, he would appear nearby, trying to start conversations that made me uneasy. He would make comments about how much he enjoyed my company and suggested we spend more time together. As much as I tried to be polite, I began to avoid running into him. I wanted to focus on my training, but it was hard when I felt like he was always around. One day, after a training session, I was heading to the bathroom when I had an experience that truly concerned me. He was in the same area and tried to continue a conversation I had already made clear I didn't want to have. It was an odd situation, and I felt cornered. Thankfully, I managed to get out of there quickly, and at that moment, I realized I needed to talk to someone about it. I knew this wasn't normal, so I decided to report his behavior to the training supervisors. They took my concerns seriously and started investigating the situation. After reviewing everything, they discovered that the man hadn't completed all the steps of the training verification process, which raised even more red flags. He was removed from the program, and the situation was resolved without further issues. The experience taught me an important lesson about trusting my instincts and the value of seeking help when something doesn't feel right. The supervisory team acted quickly, making me feel safe again during the training and ready to continue my journey on the cruise. Looking back now, I realize how crucial it is to speak up and report situations that cause discomfort or concern. It was supposed to be a quiet night. My parents were out, and I was home with my girlfriend, Julie. We were watching a movie on the living room couch, enjoying the weekend. My house is near a canal, and it's common to see people kayaking or boating, taking in the silence and tranquility of the water. So, when I saw a man in a kayak on the canal in the late afternoon, I didn't think much of it. He was paddling slowly, as if taking in the surroundings, but something about the way he looked at our house bothered me. It wasn't just a quick glance from someone passing by. It was more fixed, as if he were studying it. I mentioned it to Julie, but we soon brushed it off and went back to the movie, thinking it was nothing. Night fell, and everything was quiet. The house was lit only by the soft glow of the TV, and the sound of the wind and water in the canal was calming. Around 10 p.m., while we were in the bedroom, I heard a strange sound outside, like something scraping against the house. I went to the window, and what I saw made my heart race. There was the same man I had seen earlier in the kayak, but this time he was standing on the lawn, right near our window, holding a flashlight. The beam flickered towards the bedroom, and he was waving, as if trying to get our attention. I froze for a moment, not understanding what he was doing there. Why would someone be waving a flashlight at a house at night? I think he needs help, Julie suggested, but the uncertainty in her voice mirrored what I was feeling. I cracked the window open and asked what he wanted. The man, with a low and calm voice, said he was lost and needed help finding his way back to the canal. He seemed far too calm for someone lost, and the way he kept staring at the house made me uneasy. Something wasn't right. A knot formed in my stomach, but I still told him I would help. I grabbed my phone, put it in my pocket, and against my better judgment, walked outside to see what he needed. As I approached the lawn, something inside me screamed to be cautious. That's when I heard Julie scream from the window. "He's running toward you." I looked ahead and saw the man sprinting, his flashlight swinging in his hand, now pointed directly at me. Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. I ran back to the house, with him closing in, and slammed the door shut just as I made it inside. My fingers trembled as I locked every door and window, and Julie was already on the phone, calling the police. We stood in the living room, out of breath, listening for any sign that he was trying to break in. The sound of the wind seemed amplified, and with every creak of the house's wood, my heart jumped. But after a few minutes, everything went quiet. There were no more signs of the man. When the police arrived, we searched around the house and by the canal, but there was no trace of him or the kayak. It was as if he had simply vanished into the night. The officers said they would patrol the area, but without more information, there wasn't much they could do. That incident left me unsettled for weeks. Who was that man? And why was he trying to lure me outside? The image of him standing there with the flashlight, then sprinting toward me, still sends shivers down my spine. Since that night, I always double-check the doors and windows before going to bed. The canal, once a symbol of peace, now brings an unease I can't quite explain. We had been looking forward to that cruise for months. After years of studying, exams, and pressure, we were finally free. My friends and I decided that the best way to celebrate our high school graduation was with a cruise, an unforgettable trip full of parties and adventure. At first, everything went as planned. The sun shone during the day, the nights were filled with laughter and drinks, and the ship felt like a floating paradise in the middle of the ocean. On the third day, late at night, We found ourselves in one of the more secluded areas of the deck, far from the loud music and vibrant party lights. The sky was dark, with no moon, and the stars sparkled against the black, choppy ocean below us. We were all a bit tipsy, laughing and enjoying the end of a long night. That's when we met a group of guys we hadn't seen before. They were a bit more aggressive than the party atmosphere called for, especially one guy a little older than us, probably in his mid-20s. What started as casual conversation quickly turned into a competition of who was braver, more daring. In the middle of it all, my friend Daniel became the focus of their taunts. "You say you're brave? Then prove it," the man said, looking directly at Daniel. "Jump off the ship. Show us you've got real guts." The mood shifted. I knew Daniel, even drunk, wasn't the type to get into trouble, but something changed in him that night. Maybe it was the alcohol or the pressure to impress. But before we could stop him, Daniel looked at us with a defiant grin. "I can do it," he said, laughing like it was a joke. "That's crazy, Daniel. Don't do it," I yelled, grabbing his arm, but he was already determined. My other friends tried to talk him down, but the combination of alcohol and peer pressure made him ignore our warnings. Without a second thought, he climbed onto the deck's railing and, with a clumsy leap, disappeared into the dark ocean below. The sound of him hitting the water was muffled by the waves, and for a moment, no one said anything. The group that had egged him on began laughing, as if it was all some kind of joke. But soon, panic took over. Daniel had vanished from sight. We rushed to the railing, shouting his name, peering into the churning water, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. At first, we could hear his voice, calling out as he tried to swim against the waves. But the sea was violent that night. The ship's lights were too dim to illuminate enough, and all we could see was darkness. Then one of the guys from the group screamed, his voice high-pitched and full of terror. "There's something in the water," he yelled, pointing to a spot farther out. I looked where he was pointing, and my heart froze. In the faint light from the ship, I could see the outline of a fin cutting through the water, heading straight toward Daniel. A shark. We began screaming frantically for help. Within minutes, crew members arrived, alerted by our cries, and the alarm was sounded. Searchlights began sweeping across the ocean, and everyone was in a panic. But no matter how hard we tried, we could no longer see Daniel. The waves were too strong, the ocean unforgiving, and the shark. Everything happened too fast. I felt helpless, stuck on the deck, watching as the crew threw life rings and launched lights into the water, hoping to find Daniel. The search went on for hours, but he was never found. The mood on the ship changed completely. What was meant to be a celebratory trip turned into a nightmare. The crew did everything they could to comfort us, but we all knew what had happened. Daniel had been lost to the depths, taken by the waves and the treacherous sea. The rest of the cruise was a blur. No one had the energy for parties anymore, and every corner of the ship seemed to carry the weight of our loss. We returned home in silence, with guilt and grief as our companions. What began as a harmless dare turned into a tragedy, something none of us could have ever imagined. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still see Daniel climbing onto that railing, laughing, unaware of the danger lurking below. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the sound of the sea, the violent waves, and the emptiness where my friend disappeared. It was supposed to be a peaceful day. Laura and I were eager to enjoy the beach that summer weekend. The weather was unstable, with heavy clouds covering the sky, but neither of us cared. We wanted to walk along the sand, feel the sea breeze, and escape the routine. I hesitated for a moment, noticing the wind picking up and the waves growing larger, but Laura smiled, and any concern I had vanished. "It'll be fun," she said, holding my hand. "We don't need to swim, just a walk." Giving in to her enthusiasm, we made our way down to the beach. The sound of the waves was louder than usual, and the wind struck our faces harder with each passing minute. Still, we kept walking, talking and laughing as if the weather was a distant concern. The beach was almost empty, except for a few surfers farther down, but even they seemed cautious, watching the sea with respect. The waves were more violent now, bigger and faster, crashing against the sand with force. But we still felt safe, walking along the water's edge, until a wave, larger than any we had seen, began to form. "Look at the size of that one," Laura said, pointing to the horizon. Before we could react, the wave slammed into us, sweeping our feet out from under us and throwing us to the ground. Its force knocked me off balance, and everything around me turned to chaos. The water was everywhere, salty, heavy, dragging us along the sand. When I finally managed to get up, gasping and covered in sand, I looked around searching for Laura. But she wasn't there. I spun in every direction, calling her name, but all I could hear was the roar of the sea. Then I saw her, too far away, being pulled deeper into the water by the waves, struggling to stay afloat. My heart raced, and without thinking, I ran toward the water, diving into the violent waves. The current was too strong, each wave pushing me back, as if the sea was determined to keep Laura out of my reach. I screamed her name, trying to get closer, but each time she resurfaced, the distance between us seemed to grow. She looked at me one last time, fear in her eyes as clear as the turbulent sea surrounding her. And then she was gone. A wave crashed over her, and when the water receded, Laura was no longer there. I kept swimming, desperate, searching for any sign of her, shouting until my voice gave out, but it was all in vain. The ocean, with its relentless power, had taken Laura from me, and there was nothing I could do. When I finally made it back to the shore, exhausted and in shock, I could barely breathe. The tide kept rising, as if mocking my helplessness. I stood there, my feet sinking into the sand, staring at the horizon, hoping that somehow Laura would return. But she didn't. The days that followed were a blur. Rescue teams were called, boats and helicopters scoured the area, but Laura had vanished into the sea without a trace. Each night, I sat alone, listening to the distant sound of the waves, blaming myself for going to that beach, for ignoring the signs, for not being able to save her. If only I had said no, if I had insisted we stay home, none of this would have happened. Those thoughts haunt me to this day. That day at the beach, which should have been just another peaceful summer moment, became the worst memory of my life. The ocean, which once brought peace and beauty, now only brings memories of loss and regret. And every time I hear the sound of the waves, I'm transported back to that moment, reliving the instant she disappeared, and the guilt I carry with me never seems to fade. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was summer, and the nights were too hot to keep the windows closed. I spent most of my time sitting in my room, the window open to let the air circulate, trying to escape the stifling heat. That's when I began to notice a woman frequently walking past my house. She moved slowly down the street, always with her gaze fixed on my window. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, something not worth worrying about. Maybe she was just a neighbor I hadn't noticed before, nothing more. But as the days went by, her presence became more constant. Every time I looked out the window, there she was staring. She never said anything, never waved. She just looked, her face emotionless, as if waiting for something. The unease slowly grew inside me, but I tried to brush it off. I thought maybe I was overreacting, that my mind was creating irrational scenarios. Everything changed when she started getting closer. On a stifling afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. I went to answer without thinking much, and there she was. The same woman who had been walking past my window, now standing at my door. Her face was even more unsettling up close, with a subtle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Before I could say anything, she spoke. "We have a connection. Something you don't understand yet." My mind struggled to process her words as discomfort turned into fear. I asked her where she knew me from, trying to stay calm. She just smiled wider and continued talking about how we were connected somehow, something I would discover soon. I quickly shut the door, my heart racing. It felt like I had let something strange into my life, and now I didn't know how to get rid of it. The days that followed were worse. She started knocking on the door more frequently, talking about signs and spiritual connections. Every time I saw her outside, the feeling of claustrophobia grew stronger. It didn't matter the time, Morning, afternoon, or night, she would appear. Sometimes, she just stood in front of my window, staring. Other times, she muttered to herself, whispering things I couldn't quite hear, but I knew they were about me. Fear and frustration began to pile up. I started closing the curtains, locking all the doors, avoiding being home as much as possible. But every time I returned, I felt like she was lurking, waiting for the right moment to show up again. The nights grew longer, sleep harder to come by. Even stepping out the front door became a challenge, as I never knew when I would find her there. Then, the final time she came, everything became unbearable. One night, I heard frantic banging on the door. The sound echoed through the house, louder and more insistent than before. I went to the door, hesitating, and looked through the peephole. There she was, her eyes wide, breathing heavily. She started shouting about our supernatural connection, saying I couldn't run anymore, and that the universe had bound us together. Every word made me tremble more, and in that moment, I realized this had gone too far. I decided to call the police. By the time the officers arrived, she had already disappeared. I explained the whole situation, describing the days of stalking and her bizarre behavior. They patrolled the neighborhood, but they didn't find her. They gave me instructions on what to do if she returned and assured me they'd keep an eye on the area in the coming days. And then, as if part of a nightmare that had finally ended, she vanished. I didn't see the woman on the street again, nor at my door, and the knocking stopped. There were no more signs of her, as if she had never existed. But even with the relief of her absence, the experience left me deeply shaken. To this day, I don't know what was really behind her behavior. Maybe she was just a disturbed person, or maybe she truly believed in what she was saying. But the idea that someone can appear, observe, and invade your life with such intensity, it stays with you. Now, every time I hear a noise at night, even from far off, I still feel that familiar chill. The feeling of being watched never fully goes away. My family has always loved camping. It was our way to escape the routine, disconnect from the world, and spend time together in nature. That summer, we decided to explore a more isolated place than usual. We found a remote campsite, a small property in a mountainous region, far from any town. It was the perfect spot, no other campers around, just us surrounded by the silence of the trees and the singing of birds. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the property owner greeted us with a friendly smile. He showed us around, mentioning that we'd be the only ones camping there over the weekend. The idea of having all that space to ourselves seemed amazing. Without the hustle and bustle of other campers, we could completely relax and enjoy the peace. The landscape was breathtaking, with a small trail leading to a crystal-clear lake. We set up our tents near some tall trees, with dusk gently settling around us. The first night was peaceful. We made a campfire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories. When fatigue hit, we went to bed early, lulled by the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. The calmness of the place was almost too comforting. However, the next morning, as we were having breakfast by the fire, the property owner showed up again. He seemed hesitant, as if struggling to find the right words. "Did you notice anything strange last night?" he asked, his eyes scanning the trees around us. We looked at each other confused. The night had been completely quiet, with nothing unusual apart from the sounds of nature. "No, everything seemed normal," my dad replied, curious. "Why do you ask?" The owner scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Well, I was doing a round late at night and noticed someone walking near your campsite in the shadows. I didn't see their face, but I thought maybe one of you had gone out. When I realized everyone was in their tents, I got a little puzzled. A chill ran down my spine." My dad stayed silent for a moment, absorbing the information. But none of us left. We were all asleep, my mom said, her voice filled with concern. The owner frowned and shook his head. "I know. That's what made it strange. I didn't see anything else after that, but I thought you should know." The carefree mood instantly shifted. The thought of someone wandering around our campsite in the middle of the night, without us knowing, left us all on edge. We began replaying the events of the previous night, searching for any signs that might indicate the presence of an intruder, but nothing seemed out of place. Suddenly, the place that had been our peaceful retreat felt far more sinister. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hide a secret. My dad tried to stay calm, suggesting it might have been just an animal or a lost hiker. But the look on the owner's face told a different story. "I've worked here for years," he said, "and I've never seen anyone walking around this area in the middle of the night, especially with this much isolation." Not wanting to risk another night with that uncertainty, we quickly started packing up the campsite. We didn't talk much, but we all knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave my mind. Even in broad daylight, the idea that someone had been out there in the shadows while we slept left a knot in my stomach. When we finished packing, the owner walked us to the car. He tried to reassure us, saying he'd keep an eye on the property, but the discomfort had already settled in. As we drove away, I glanced back, watching the campsite disappear into the distance. The trees swayed in the wind, and the silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive. Who was that person? Why were they lurking around the campsite? We never found out, and though we tried to forget, the experience left a lasting mark on us. Camping, something that had once brought us so much joy, now carries an unsettling shadow of uncertainty. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 8 scary true urban exploration horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.